I'm one of the pastors here at First Baptist Orlando, and it's great to welcome all of you all to our summit on religious freedom tonight. We're thrilled that you've chosen to join us. Some of you are joining us for the first time, but I see faces that I recognize from previous occasions, and you'll notice that we have us seated a little differently tonight. And that is because we desire part of our time to have dialogue around the table, and we'll lead you through that experience in just a little bit. But I want to say on behalf of First Baptist Church how grateful we are to host this event. We're proud to be affiliated with the Commission on Religious Freedom, and we believe this is an important issue for us to be involved in and participate in, and we take great joy in being able to host it. So if we can do anything to make you feel more comfortable during your time here, we want to do that. Please just let me know. Again, my name is Danny, and I'd be thrilled to host you in any way necessary. So tonight we're going to begin our time together with an invocation by Reverend Katrina Jenkins. She serves as the Dean of Religious Life at one of our local universities, Rollins College. Would you please help me welcome I can't even talk tonight, Katrina Jenkins. Sorry.
Good evening, everyone. I can't speak either. Let us gather together in prayer. Most gracious one, we come to you in gratitude for this gathering, where we not only can learn from each other, but to find ways to build bridges. Help us to foster understanding and peace through our common threads of faith, spiritual practices, and beliefs. Help us to come out of our own silos, to join together as a collective voice to support each other in shaping religious freedom in the Orlando area and beyond. Help us to learn and to love each other as neighbors. And even when we disagree, help us to meet at the point of respect and humanness. May we continue the lifelong process of learning and supporting one another. Help this to be a time of fostering understanding. And we thank you for these opportunities to connect and learn. And then finally, bless the speakers and organizers and participants of this event tonight. Bless all that is said and done. Amen.
Thank you, Katrina, and thank you for being here. It's great to have you here, and we appreciate all of your leadership at Rollins College and what you're doing there at a wonderful institution here in our community. So tonight's event is going to be hosted by myself and two friends. I've already introduced myself. Many of you know David Williamson. David serves, yes, you can clap for David. David is the co-founder of the Central Florida Free Thought Community and a local leader in the secular humanist community. And David is a friend and somebody that I have grown to love and appreciate, and from whom I have learned a lot. And so I'm thrilled to have David with us. And then joining us also is Ben Friedman, and you can clap for him too. And Ben is a commission member. He serves on the Commission for Religious Freedom and is representing the Jewish community. So the three of us together will serve kind of as your host and MC in our group time that we'll experience together in just a little bit. So once again, thank you, David and Ben, for participating with us tonight. And then I want to introduce to you Jim Coffin. Jim serves as the Executive Director of the Interfaith Council of Central Florida. The truth be known, a lot of what you're experiencing through the efforts on religious freedom have its birth in relationships with Jim Coffin, who helped in many ways to bring many of us together to begin having these conversations. So in a real way, here in our community, Jim has served as the catalyst to help build the relationships that are the commission today. And Jim is here to introduce our special guest. Help me thank Jim and welcome him to the platform.
I don't like to take a long time to introduce speakers because I'd rather let them do the speaking. However, I thought it might be a safe thing to talk to Reverend Dr. Gary Mason's wife and find out what I should say. And so I asked her to give me the three most important things that I needed to convey to you about what Gary has done. And so we start off with the fact that for 28 years he was a United Methodist minister in what he describes as the sharp edge of conflict in Belfast, Ireland, Northern Ireland. And so he has worked there in that context. He has moved beyond that sharp edge of conflict to the Middle East and has spent a lot of time then working in the Middle East to try to bring peace between Palestinians and Israelis and any other areas where there are tension there. And so that has kept him busy, and he's traveled to the United States considerably, and he has a kind of an annual pilgrimage to Orlando, at least one, and maybe more, and so he's greatly appreciated by the Florida Conference of the United Methodist Church and also the St. Luke's United Methodist Church. And one of the things that he has done, which is interesting, and he can tell you about that, is that he oversaw the construction. He inspired the construction, I really should say, more than just oversaw it, of a $30 million building called the Skanes Building. And the way he describes it is this way: it's a post-conflict, shared faith, interfaith context where people can come together. And he also oversees a program called Rethinking Conflict. So I'd like to have you give a big hand to Reverend Dr. Gary Mason, who is here all the way from Belfast, Northern Ireland, and you will recognize that he wasn't born in Orlando. I guarantee it. And also, Joyce, would you wave your hand so that we appreciate having you here.
Okay, Jim, thank you for your warm words of welcome, and thank you for taking time to come out tonight. What I want to do initially is really set a context for my life, for some of my work, and then ask you to some of my experiences resonate with you. So I'm not here tonight under any circumstances to give you kind of points 1 to 7 in dealing with difference and handling conflict. I mean, I often smile sometimes when I go into American bookstores, and invariably I see books 7 Steps to Spiritual Success, 7 Steps to Building a Great Business, and I often say never buy those books because there really are no simple 7 steps to anything. So what I'm going to do tonight is be very open, very candid, very transparent with my life in peace building, and see together, those of us who have been shaped by different faiths, those of us who have not been shaped by any faith, is there some common ground, is there some synergy that we can learn together in a much better way? The Irish conflict goes back 800 years, so we're not going to have a long, protracted history lesson tonight. But in the period that I lived through, which was really 69 to 1998, in a very, very small space, and Northern Ireland is a very small space, 1.7 million people, we had 47,000 injuries, 36,000 shootings, 22,000 armed robberies, 16,000 bombings, almost 4,000 deaths, and 30,000 political prisoners. If I was to extrapolate those figures into the United States, so very simply put, if my conflict had have taken place in your space, you would have had 800,000 dead and 6.4 million political prisoners. So suffice to say, even 22 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, we are still dealing with legacy and dealing with the past. For 28 years of my ministry, I spent no more than 100 to 150 yards from what we kind of call peace lines, which are primarily large Berlin-type walls which segregate Catholics and Protestants, particularly in the city of Belfast. So So that's context. I want to kind of talk, let me just flip these up here a little. Growing up as a kid in the 60s and in the 70s, a colleague of mine said someone in the late 1960s did not fly over Northern Ireland, spray us all with lunatic gas, and we woke up one day and decided to start killing each other. So it was a context that allowed our conflict to begin. And primarily, from my perspective, two of the things that fed into our conflict were toxic politics and toxic religion. Let me say it was never a religious war. So we're not going back to the kind of 16th and 17th century of Reformation and Counter-Reformation. But there was a toxic theology that fed into our space that allowed people to believe God was undoubtedly on their side and not on the other person's side. Conflict invariably has three components to it: land, identity, and religion. So as a young child, spilling through the 60s and the 70s, I remember in 1972, which was our worst year of violence, there was a terrorist incident every 40 minutes. So think of it. 365 days, every 40 minutes, we had a terrorist incident. And in the late 1980s, I was ordained in 1987. As a very young clergy person, a group of clergy from the two traditions began a dialogue with those who were pursuing political violence or terrorism, whatever phraseology you want to use. So that begs the question: should people of faith be dialoguing with people who are pursuing violence? The answer to that, from my perspective, is a categorical yes. Because I think religious leaders need to step into those frameworks, and I think we need to create what I call a moral framework to show people there are alternatives to pursuing political violence. And so that phrase I'm using there, from armed struggle to political struggle, particularly in the mindset of republicanism or the IRA, was a long projected journey. Up until really the early 1980s, the IRA primarily were pursuing terrorism or political violence. But they began to evolve really into what they called the Armalite in one hand and the ballot box in the other. In other words, pursuing both armed struggle and also pursuing politics at the same time. And so the key to move them into a complete political space was for clergy, academics, women's groups, business leaders, what I call civil society. We have a theory back home called the political peace process versus the social peace process. Politicians work on the assumption that once a deal is done, that once a peace deal is done, societal healing automatically follows. Let me assure you, nothing could be further from the truth. Politicians, and I have many friends who are politicians, politicians by their very nature are people of short-term vision. And the most important thing in a politician's life invariably is the next election. You look at the moment in Israel, you look in your space, us Europeans sympathise considerably with you Americans, at least in the British-Irish context. We just get 6 weeks notice for our election. You poor people have to suffer this stuff literally for months and years listening to all this here. But you know, by and large, politicians can be people of incredibly short-term vision. And that's why we have the political peace process versus the social peace process. So what is the social peace process? What does that look like? It's made up of people like you and people like me. People of faith, business leaders, academics, women's groups. And if there's one key lesson from the Irish peace process, is really civic society has really been the social glue that has held our peace process together. I mean, up until January just passed, we didn't have a functioning, devolved administration government for 3 years over a multiplicity of issues. And people coming through my space often used to say to me, why have you not gone back to war? And the primary reason we didn't go back to war was because civic society was the social glue holding our peace process together. And that's why I'm suggesting in point 4 that people in your space need to take what I call a multidisciplinary approach to peace building. And I think you're already doing that to a large degree. I often illustrate it like this. Within a medical framework, if I was to take cancer, invariably I'm under a number of different consultants. The days are long gone, as we know, of one physician dealing with you. You're under a skill base of a number of different consultants. And that's why I think in peace building we need a multidisciplinary approach. I was in Jerusalem in 2016. The Hebrew University had put together a conference on transitional justice. That was put together by a lawyer working at the Hebrew University and also a lawyer in London. And my concern was that basically we were going to spend a full week looking at transitional justice in a legal framework. But they were too clever for that, because they asked that conference theologians, philosophers, historians, a multiplicity of people to bring a more rounded, multidisciplinary approach to peace building. And so I want to say to you, in this room with many different skill bases, no single person in this space has the capability to move dialogue forward, to facilitate it on their own. You need to develop this multidisciplinary approach. Sorry, just pull that back. The other thing you need to do is have the integrity to ask the difficult questions. I think one of the difficulties I have found in my life, in the Christian context, some people in my space assumed if we could just get Catholics and Protestants together, worshipping in the same space, that all would be okay. I'm not against that. But we facilitated in my space what we called uncomfortable conversations. We wrestled with the real difficult issues. We wrestled with legacy issues. As I look at your space today in the United States, I remember a scholar in Upper West Side, Manhattan, a number of years ago writing an article in which he said, no one in the United States wants to deal with the legacy of slavery. And I just responded to that scholar and I said, there's a really interesting S word. Let me tell you about my S word. It's called sectarianism. And then we had the courage to deal with sectarianism, and we ended up spilling into a 30-year bloody civil war. So I think in your spaces, you need to have the courage to address the difficult issues. I remember about 3 years ago, a church in St. Petersburg, Hyde Park United Methodist Church, actually in Tampa, began what they were calling a civic conversation. I remember addressing a room, not dissimilar to this, about 100, 150 people, and speaking, and when I was finished, a gentleman to my right-hand side, the same skin colour as myself, he said, you know, Gary, I agree with you. I'm just not sure we're ready to address these issues. And as he finished, an African-American lady sitting at the back of the room, I'm assuming in her 80s, said, Gary, can I talk to this room as a person about that phrase you used, the legacy of slavery? And she simply just told her story. And I let her for about 5 to 10 minutes. And when she was finished, I turned to the gentleman on my right-hand side. And I said, sir, how do you feel listening to this lady's story? And he says, Gary, you're right. We need to deal with these issues. But I said, can I just ask you one more question? How long have you been coming to this church? And he said, I'm guessing 40 years. I asked the African-American lady how long she'd been coming. She said 60 years. then I ask the most obvious question. Can you as a congregation or as a faith community help me understand how your two lives have been centered on a faith space for 40 years and you've never heard one another's story? Okay? So I think it begs the question of how we do religion. And I think if we're honest, sometimes religion simply covers up the difficulties. And in reality, I've often said, sometimes faith spaces can actually be the most difficult and dishonest places on the planet. So I want to suggest here, particularly to people of faith tonight, that we need key religious leadership. And I think that begins with honesty. The Jewish theologian Jonathan Sacks, whom I know, who lives in London, Sacks said on one point, and it is a substantial one: the critics of religion are right. Religion has done harm. It has led to crusades, jihads, inquisitions, and pogroms. It has shed the blood of human sacrifice in the name of high ideals. People have hated in the name of God, practiced cruelty in the name of the God of compassion, waged war in the name of the God of peace, and killed in the name of the God of life. Those are undeniable facts, and they are terrifying. Interestingly, the great believers have always known this. I mean, Pascal said, men never do evil so completely and cheerfully as when they do it from a religious conviction. Jonathan Swift, who was the Dean of Christ Church in Dublin, we probably remember him more as the writer of Gulliver's Travels that some of us read as children. Swift said, "We have just enough religion to make us hate, but not enough to make us love one another." And C.S. Lewis, who was born in Belfast, even at my age, I still play squash, maybe not as well as what I once did, but my squash club is facing C.S. Lewis's boyhood home. And C.S. Lewis said this: "I think we must fully face the fact that when Christianity does not make a man very much better, invariably it makes him very much worse." And that happens not because religion is religion, but because human beings are human beings. They're not angels, and they're certainly not God. And religion, as we all know in this building tonight, those who believe and those who don't, religion is power. It bonds people as a group, it moves people to act, it changes lives, and whatever is power can be used, misused, and abused. Religion is like fire, as Sacks says, it warms but it also burns. And we are the guardians of that flame. So I need to ask you a question tonight in a religious context. Is your brand of religion warming people, or is it burning people? I'm just going to skip out the important signals to give us time to move through some of this. The Good Friday Agreement very, very quickly created a win-win situation for the two opposing sides. And one of the keys to the Good Friday Agreement was not humiliating the other person. So in your conversations, in your dialogue, in your discussion, if your aim, be it within a political, a sociological, a philosophical, or a theological framework, is to humiliate the other person, you're never going to create a win-win situation. George Mitchell, the Democratic senator from Maine, as you know, chaired the talks leading up to the Good Friday Agreement, and Mitchell was spot on when he said, if you think getting this agreement was difficult, implementing it will be even more difficult. I can tell you 22 years after the signing of that Good Friday Agreement, the Irish peace process is still a very fragile peace process. So how do you create in your space in Central Florida? How do you create a win-win situation for those with whom you disagree? And I want to underline just for a few moments the importance of words. There was a Jewish theologian that said it was words, not machines, that created Auschwitz. Okay? It was words, not machines, that created Auschwitz. So I'm going to suggest that language is incredibly important. How we speak of the other is incredibly important. As we all knew within this room, Nazism very cleverly took what every person in this room would call religious anti-Semitism and repackaged it as racial anti-Semitism. And Adolf Hitler, I can assure you, was not a card-carrying evangelical, but he still wrote in the second chapter in Mein Kampf, "Today I believe I am acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator in defending myself against the Jews." So what Nazism did very cleverly was repackage religious anti-Semitism in a sociological framework, and ultimately we know the end result. So linguistic violence in the public space, both religiously and politically, I would suggest to you, is at an all-time high. As the sages of Judaism said, whoever speaks with an evil tongue kills 3 people. The one who says it, the one who accepts it, and the one about whom it is said. So I want to suggest to you that language is absolutely crucial in this space. Let me just pull these up. They're obviously set within a context of my faith, which is Christianity, but they have applicability to every person in this room. As I said to you unashamedly, the church in my context needs to have the ability to repent. In the early 1990s, as a very young clergy person, I spent 2 years on a working party on sectarianism, and sadly, very quickly, we found ourselves back in the toxic nature of the 16th and 17th century, looking at the religious wars in Europe and all the chaos that ensued out of that. Basically, that theology of superiority. So I'm going to suggest that my tradition, I'm not going to speak for yours, we need to lament. We need to grieve for what has been lost, what has been done. We need to acknowledge anger, bitterness, pain, resentment, loss of identity, and uncertainty. I know this contextually. I know a person whom I grew up with who got involved in political violence, and they said to me quite honestly, "Gary, when you were taught Catholics were S-H-I-T in Sunday school, it was much easier to kill them." When you were taught Catholics were S-H-I-T in Sunday school, it was much easier to kill them. And often I say that in American audiences, there's a sharp intake of breath. But then I have to remind you, dear Americans, remember when JFK was about to get into the White House, you had people walking up and down the Mall in Washington with banners, "No papishes or Romanists in the White House." So your space, trust me, is not clean either. We have this ability to constantly demonize the other person. So I'm suggesting, in my context, the church has to learn the power of lament. If you're a person here who is not practicing theology, saying sorry for what you've done wrong. I also want to suggest that storytelling is absolutely key. I spent my life with Palestinians, Israelis, Catholics, Protestants, back home and in your context as well, encouraging people to tell their story. And the scholar Gottschall comments that science backs up the long-held belief that story is the most powerful means of communicating a message. And it's been rightly commented that all of us in this room are creatures of story. And the process of changing The mind of the whole world begins with that little phrase that all of us remember from childhood. And you do remember when an aunt, uncle, mom or dad, grandparents came and sat at the side of your bed, and you were sitting there with your pajamas on before going asleep. They said 4 words and your eyes lit up. Once upon a time. So I want to ask all you faith communities here and others, are your organizations, your synagogues, your churches, your temples, your mosques, your pubs, creating once upon a time moments? In our context, a number of us really tried hard to use sacred space for having uncomfortable conversations. When the Ulster Volunteer Force, who were the most lethal Protestant terrorist militia grouping, responsible for hundreds of deaths in my conflict, when they read out their weapons decommissioning statement to the world's press, they read it from my church. People would ask the question, you mean you let people into your church who had pursued violence? Well, as I read the ancient texts, they talk to me about beating swords into plowshares. I have to ask the question, what more fitting space for people who have been pursuing violence to read out a statement renouncing violence than in the context of a faith community? So I'm asking you the question, are you creating spaces where people hear each other's stories? I also want to ask, do you understand each other's joint suffering? So how do we provide spaces for people to hear each other, hear the pain, the injustices, the acknowledgement, the mutual recognition of the legitimacy of their experience is absolutely decisive in the reconciliation dynamic. Because all of us in this room know if hurt, pain, anger, guilt are not dealt with and driven underground, they will be acted out in other ways. The whole concept of forgiveness, and I tell this story in my own faith context. But if you remember way back to Christmas Day 1983 in Rome, Pope John Paul II had gone into the Rabiba prison to meet the Turkish-born terrorist who had attempted to murder him 2 years earlier. And if you recall, the television cameras recorded that wordless scene that made an indelible impression on a world soaked in bigotry, hatred, terrorism and bloodshed. And if you recall, the 2 men talked, their heads very close together, and when the Pope emerged from the prison room, the world's media around him said, "What did you say?" He said, "What I said will remain a secret between him and me. But I spoke to him as a brother whom I pardon." 2 weeks later, Time magazine, secular magazine, devoted 7 full pages to consider the question, why forgive? I still remember the front cover. It was a black cover, red question mark with the inscription, "Why forgive?" And the senior writer, Lance Morrow, said this: "In my context, Christ preached forgiveness. The loving of one's enemies is the center of the New Testament. Stated nakedly, superficially, the proposition sounds perverse, even self-destructive, an invitation to disaster. Morrow says forgiveness is not an impulse that is in much favor. It's a mysterious and sublime idea in many ways." He comments the prevalent style in the world runs much more akin to the mentality of the high plains drifter, a cold, numb remorselessness. But he finished with a sentence which I've never forgotten. He said, "Forgiveness does not look like a tool for survival in a bad world, but that is exactly what it is." Forgiveness does not look like a tool for survival in a bad world, but that is exactly what it is. So listening in the role of acknowledgement. A colleague of mine said that during our conflict, most people in our churches did not have guns in their hands, but they most certainly had them in their hearts. Let me just say that again. During our conflict, most people in our churches did not have guns in their hands, but they most certainly had them in their hearts. And so I think one of the things that faith communities can do is create spaces where people hear the other person's story. The number of lessons I think we have for other conflicts are things like inclusion, putting all the issues on the agenda, addressing all the root causes, patience, understanding, confidentiality. In the last 7 years, I've hosted 1,000 Israelis and Palestinians in Belfast, of all shades of opinion. So if you want to do this work, if you're going to get into a gathering with people who just think like you, who are liberal, centre-left, and you're going to listen to each other, forget it. It's a waste of time. So I've got all shades of opinion. Centre-right, hard-right, centrist, those on the left, from both Palestinian and Israeli society. And I often ask them, I don't tell them what they need to do, I often ask them, what do you learn from the Irish peace process? And they tell me 5 lessons. They say political leadership is essential to achieving peace. I'm not commenting on the current leadership in the Israeli-Palestinian framework at the moment, but I do know this. In our context, we had a Tony Blair, Bertie Ahern. No matter why you're a Republican or Democrat here tonight, I often say, no matter who the president is, if they get something right, at least have the decency to say, well done. And Bill Clinton did play a very significant role in our peace process, and many other Republican and Democratic senators as well. So political leadership is essential. Israelis and Palestinians always say to me, you know that phrase, Gary, you don't understand, we don't have a partner for peace. And I often remind them when we began these conversations, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, we were talking to people with a hell of a lot of blood on their hands. I mean a lot of blood. I said, you think those first meetings we had, it was all hugs and kisses? They were painful. They were difficult. But real relationships began to develop in the context of relationship. So I'm just asking you a question. Are your faith communities creating spaces for people to build meaningful relationships? The third thing that always comes up is security. And security is important. For those within the Israeli mindset, security is paramount. And no matter what your context here is tonight, if I lived through 2,000 years of anti-Semitism and the Shoah, I'm being honest, security would be important to me. But in our conversations we point out, in my context, we only got real security when we dealt with the root causes of the conflict. So I don't care whether that's in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, South Africa, the Irish context, or in your context. So I'm going to ask you a question. Are you, as a group of faith people, or a group of people who are known faith, but our terminology is people of goodwill? Because America is a very conflicted society at the moment. Are you dealing with the root causes of your conflict? I'm not naming them. That's your job. The fourth thing they often say, and we learn together, is the futility of violence. I mean, in my context, we had enough hidden weapons in that tiny island of Ireland to kill each other for several hundred more years. But we came in the early 1990s to what we called a mutually hurting stalemate. We realized either we get over this line or we're going to pass this to the next generation and the next generation. And the fifth thing they say that I alluded to there at the beginning of my talk is the role of civic society in building peace, the social peace process. Let me assure you this, politicians will not change the United States. They are part of the changing process. But if you leave the total change of this nation in the hands of politicians, let me assure you, you will not succeed. So that's why people in this room, faith leaders, academics, business people, women's groups, NGOs, need to be the real social glue that holds this nation together. I'll finish there, and we're doing questions now. I'm not sure of all the
Test 1, 2. Thank you, Dr. Mason. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to take questions. If somebody has a question you want to speak into the microphone, we're actually going to take that risk tonight and let you ask the question. Some of you may prefer not to speak, and yet you have a question. There are little cards on your table, 3x5 cards, blank cards there, and you can write the question out, and we'll take the questions as we can. We're going to have about 10 minutes or so for us to ask questions. So, Ben, I think you have someone there. Go ahead.
Okay. So why don't you start by telling us your name and then ask your question.
My name is Glenn Hawkins, and can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by telling their story?
We often create this space, Glenn, back home, that we call listening circles. You need a good facilitator, undoubtedly, to do that, because as in any group dynamic, invariably there's one or two, or perhaps more, want to dominate that conversation. So it's really just hearing that person's life story, what has shaped them, the difficulties they've had. And I know in our context, now, I mean, we have leading people who were in the IRA, and leading people who were in even the British Army and the Protestant organisations, those more militia organisations, sharing one another's story. And I'll give you an example. I had a delegation from Florida 2 years ago where a very leading IRA figure, very senior figure, openly said, if I had been born 200 yards on the other side of the fence, I probably would have joined a Protestant militia organisation. So how do you create spaces? So I mean, if you want to put it in this context of race, I mean, I'll tell you a story. I was speaking at a conference, the venue will be nameless. I was comparing racism and sectarianism. I walked down from the podium, and a guy called Bill, that's all you're getting, name-wise, come up to me and he said, I don't agree with what you said. All you're doing is annoying the blacks. He was white, obviously. I said, I'm what, Bill? He says, you're annoying the blacks. You're reminding them of slavery. So I said, tell me, Bill, have you ever had a conversation with a black person about the legacy of slavery? To which Bill said, no. So that's what I mean. About opening spaces like this, to have those uncomfortable, difficult conversations, listening to the other person's story, knowing their narrative, and seeing what shaped them, and trying to build a meaningful, cohesive approach where you can change society together. So Bill, bless him, was an expert on racism and slavery, and he never had a conversation with the other.
That's great. Great question. We got another one right here. Dave.
Yeah, what's your name and what's your question?
Yeah, my name is Nelson Betancourt. Could you talk about, because of your experience in Ireland, could you talk about where you see this so-called peace process going that was just recently proposed by President Trump about Israel and the Palestinians?
I mean, there have been many peace processes in the Middle East. And I know a number of people that have been involved in them. The key thing from my perspective is that you need a level playing field. You need all the issues on the table, and you need to bring all the people to the table. Now, I'm not here tonight, I'm not here to criticize any person, that's not my role. But the key thing is, in our peace process, no person felt humiliated. So in other words, those who were pro-British Unionists, those who were pro-nationalist Irish Republicans, there was enough within the Good Friday Agreement for them to go out and sell to their respective constituencies. One of the most difficult things actually about building peace is not dealing with your enemy, it's dealing with your own grouping. I wrote an article actually, and listen, for those of us who are pastors, you know what it's like. I mean, some of the people out there, there's people in here, torch you with the people out there. We all know that. Those of us who have pastored churches for any length of time, in a sense. So, I wrote an article a couple of years ago with a couple of academics in the Middle East entitled, and I'll give you my card, I'll email it to you, in fact it's a free PDF book which I can email to you. It's called Intergroup Consensus. So how do you get intergroup consensus? So things like when your enemy says something, how do you reframe that in the context so that your constituency understands that? I'll give you a classic example that affected me. 1993, Shankill bombing, hellish time. I lost 2 friends in that bombing. One of the bombers, IRA, died in that bombing. Self-inflicted, not a suicide bombing. The bomb went off premature. Jerry Adams carried the bomber's coffin. People in my community, British Protestant Unionist loyalists, were going crazy. They're saying Adams is talking peace out of this side of his mouth and he's carrying the coffin of a bomber on the other side of his mouth. But those of us in the inside track knew why Adams was carrying that coffin. Because there was a struggle within the IRA between the Hawks and the Doves. Adams was trying to move the Hawks completely into a peace process. If he hadn't carried that coffin, he could have lost them. So it's knowing that reframing concept as well. But the key thing to our peace process was getting all the actors to the table. And that was bringing in your extremes. I mean, the 2 extreme parties in our space was the Democratic Unionist Party, a right-wing party, a third of which were Protestant religious fundamentalists, and Sinn Féin, the political wing of the IRA. It wouldn't have been a success unless we got those people to the table. Now, in coming to the table, the IRA particularly had to sign up to certain requirements, because people were not going to negotiate with someone who was sitting with a gun under the table. So there had to be certain parameters put into space to allow that to happen. But I often say people of goodwill and people of faith need to take strategic risks for peace.
And I think the way you said it in the talk is it's a win-win
situation.
situation,
Yeah,
right?
so it is, yeah.
And then I'm going to take liberty here. So you're talking about a national or international peace process, but it starts at the local personal level, right? Because that's where story starts, is at the local personal level.
Yeah, and I think those grassroots movements are so important. I mean, Liberia, there's an organisation I work with in the Middle East called Women Wage Peace. Primarily began as a group of Israeli women who were simply saying, we are sick and tired of our sons and daughters going to war. And they got support from Liberia. I mean, the Liberian peace process was spearheaded by women. They were the key actors in spearheading that peace process. In fact, I say this to the shame of our gender, where women are at the table, peace processes are much more likely to succeed.
Okay.
No question about that. So it is. So most times,
Just a quick reminder, if you've got a card, go ahead and wave it vigorously, but not so much that you hit your neighbor, and we'll pick that up. You've got a question back there, Ben?
Yes, right here.
Hi, my name is Rania. Thank you very much for your excellent talk. Doing well, thank you. So given the very volatile situations that you've worked in, my question is, what steps have you taken and what steps can we take to disarm participants of their preconceived notions and their personal experiences when we get together, so that when stories are being shared, they're able to actually hear what's being said and absorb it without kind of getting in their own way and kind of blocking that process?
and sometimes, the initial things, and I say this to many people in this room, Sometimes the one-to-one conversation is actually a good way to begin that. Just going out with a person and hearing their story. I mean, I know the debate that's going on in your space at the moment around white supremacists, etc., etc., etc. And I mean, if I was pastoring in a town or a city where there was a group of people who thought like that, I'm just being perfectly honest, I would seek one of those people out. And I would want to hear, tell me your narrative. What has shaped you as a person? What stories did you hear that allowed you to develop the thought pattern that you have? I think that people of faith aren't doing that. I want to be asked the question, who is doing that? So I think sometimes even those one-to-one conversations, and like, let's be honest, those of us in this room, particularly who are religious leaders, we still have that privilege of being able to access people's homes in a way, let's be honest, most other people don't have that accessibility that we have. So I think we need to use that in a moral way, not in an exploitive way, but hear that person's story. Bring it into those listening circles. A person tells their story, their narrative. It is perfectly legitimate to say someone from the opposing camp, listening to that story, tell me as a person, how do you feel? It allows them the ability to disagree, but also probe further. And often in groups that I facilitate quite a bit, and Joyce, my wife, knows this, I often say, look, don't assume this 2-hour block, it's over. Some of you people, why don't you go to Starbucks or go for a coffee a couple of days later and begin to cement those one-to-one relationships? So there's a multiplicity of ways to do this, but don't underestimate the power of storytelling, the power of that. And the other thing is there is a TED talk there as well. In fact, it was Ken Carter, who's the current Methodist Bishop of Florida. There's a TED talk called The Danger of the Single Narrative. The danger of the single narrative. That your narrative is the only narrative. Life is a multiplicity of narratives. And hearing the story of the other is absolutely crucial.
That's great. One last question right here. Your name and then the question.
Hi, my name is Janelle, and I was just wondering, I can't imagine a more hopeless situation than what is happening in Palestine, between Palestine and Israel right now. I can't imagine going into that hopeless situation. Like, what prompted you to go there? How did you even get your foot in the door, like, to get these two people even in the same room together to have any kind of conversation whatsoever? What are you doing? Like, how are you doing this?
It's relationships, honestly. I mean, we were just chatting there yesterday at dinner with a colleague yesterday. He emailed me that a group we hosted in Belfast last year, I think they're going to DC this year, called Kids for Peace. It was 5 Muslim, 5 Christian, 5 Jewish, and 1 Druze. And these kids, I mean, if you look up my Facebook page, July last year, I think there's a video posted, they made a 25-minute video of their experience in Belfast. And it's absolutely profound. I think the key sometimes as well is actually getting people out of their spaces. You know, getting them out of Palestine, getting them out of Israel. Because we found in 1996 a group of our key actors went to South Africa. And the South African peace process was very different to ours. But what they come back with was not a 1% of building peace. They come back with something that's missing in many spaces today, the word hope. That maybe, just maybe, we can move this over the line. I mean, the irony of all this, if this was the 1990s and I was doing this talk to you, I would be saying 3 conflict zones at the moment are South Africa, the Irish context, and the Israeli-Palestinian. Most people then saw apartheid coming to an end. With the Oslo Accords, it was assumed Israelis and Palestinians were over the line, and it was us cursed Irish that never could move forward. I mean, both Winston Churchill, the British bulldog, Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, said categorically, the Irish problem is intractable. Well, they were wrong. So I think it's a lot of it in the Middle East, it's leadership. It's leadership and moving people forward, and there is a dearth of leadership there at the moment to move people in the right direction. But I don't give up. You know, I don't. I mean, I was in the region in January, I was there in November. We did a conference in November, interestingly, called Divided Cities, Belfast, Sarajevo, and Nicosia. Just sharing experiences in divided cities together. So look, I know I need to stop time-wise. I think that is, and then you guys.
Thank you. Let's hear it again for that was really great. What we want to do now is we want to actually do what he's encouraging, which is to have these conversations. And part of that is having these conversations with people who you don't already know. So I want to encourage you to take this opportunity to stretch your legs and to move to a different table where you don't know everybody. And I know that that's a hard ask, which is why I'm going to ask every single person to stand up at the same time, so it's a lot easier. And I'll just spread out. It only takes 30 seconds. Just move to a table where you don't know everybody there. It's okay if you know somebody, but don't know everybody.
What's that? Yeah, I don't know any of them.